Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our series on key battles in the Revolutionary War. James, are you ready for a Christmas miracle?
I am. We're going to have some fun on Christmas. We're not just going to sit around and open presents and drink.
Some people are just going to sit around and drink, but we're going to find out.
Yes, some are, yes.
It's going to take a Christmas miracle for what's going to happen, because in the last episode, we finished with the Battle of New York, and America, or the American troops, succeeded in as much as they weren't completely annihilated and didn't get captured, and it was only due to completely lucky breaks that Washington seems to get over and over again. So he will get mulligans over the course of this war. Where we are now is Washington has bivouacked in New Jersey at New Brunswick. Bivouacking is where you're camping, but really without any shelter. But he, as a former surveyor in the wilderness, is able to handle this. But a lot of his men don't really like it. He starts out with 5,000 men, and he knows that enlistments are about to run out. 2,000 have enlistments are up on December 1st, and another 1,000 on December 31st. So he's going to lose 60% of his army in the beginning of the year. And Washington is hustling, trying to get people to extend their enlistments. It's not really working. So things are bleak at this moment in December. James, what is going to happen next?
I'm going to piggyback on what you were just saying. I'm going to make it sound even worse.
Okay, let's get down. Let's make the darkness darker before the light. If there is light.
Yeah, that's right. I think most of our listeners, at least our American listeners, are familiar with American football. So imagine that both teams are on the 50-yard line and they're lined up, and the British, we'll call the British team, we'll say there's a British team and an American team. Well, the British have pushed the American team pretty much back to the goal line, and they're about to go over and make a touchdown. And Washington has got to stop them. He's got to push back and prevent them from getting in that end zone. Now, historically speaking, here's a little bit fuller story of what had just been happened for those who may not have listened to the last episode. But if you haven't, you should go do that right now. All right, go. All right, you back? Good.
All right, good to have you.
All right, now I can continue. But just to review, Washington's army had been trying to defend the New York City area. He had some troops on Long Island, specifically, well, starting in Long Island in general on the western side, and they had been pushed back into Brooklyn Heights. And then the British were closing in on Brooklyn Heights, and Washington evacuated them overnight thanks to some fog and some other bad weather. Washington evacuated the remaining American troops off of the Brooklyn Heights into Manhattan Island. But then the British jumped in behind him at Kips Bay, and Washington barely escaped disaster while his men are running right and left, and Washington is throwing his hat on the ground. Washington and the army had retreated northward. They'd taken a stand at Harlem Heights and held off the British just for a little while, and then they had retreated further north and been defeated at White Plains. And then finally, they had to go into New Jersey, and the British were nipping at their heels. And finally, as you mentioned, they've gone all the way across New Jersey and even across the Delaware into Pennsylvania. So the British now controlled not only New York City, but pretty much all of New Jersey. And the British Army is starting to knock on the door, figuratively speaking, of Philadelphia.
Ooh,
They're only 30 miles. Yeah, 30 miles out. And that's not good, because that is where the Congress is. And that's essentially, for all intents and purposes, Philadelphia is the capital of the United States right now, or the British would say the capital of the rebellious provinces. Depends on your perspective, right, Scott?
Yeah, but I like that phraseology. It's very dignified.
Very dignified, yes, sir. But anyway, so Congress has already fled. They've already gone to Baltimore, which they believed was safer. It was certainly a little bit further away. So it's up to Washington to stop this British juggernaut that's pushed him back. You know, how many miles? I don't even know exactly how many, a couple hundred miles or maybe more. I'm not good with the geography there. But let's talk about that British Army a little bit more. Now, the British Army, of course, General William Howe was the overall commander, but Howe liked the comfortable life. Howe was not a man that loved to be out in a tent in the middle of winter. So he sends Cornwallis out to pursue Washington. But when Washington and his army crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, Cornwallis decides, nah, that we're good. We've pushed him out of 2 states now. That's good enough. So, and Howe agreed with him, and Howe ordered Cornwallis and the British Army to return to New York City for the winter. And Cornwallis was actually planning to go to London. It's nice to be a general, isn't it, Scott?
Yeah, a nice little international trip in the middle of the war, whatever.
Yeah, you could just, I need a break. Can I go?
General Patton will just go to the South Pacific to unwind after D-Day. Just relax.
Yeah, things had changed by then, hadn't they? But the things were different back in the 1700s, especially in the British Army, and especially for a general.
Yes.
I think it's in the book, The Killer Angels, in the movie Gettysburg, where General Lawrence Chamberlain says there's nothing closer to God than a general on a battlefield. So this is an illustration of that. Cornwallis is just going to hand it over to somebody else and take a little vacation. Now let's talk about Washington's army. Washington's army was down to only about 2,400 men, which was just slightly more than 10% of its strength at the Battle of Long Island. And enlistments were due to expire at the end of 1776. So here we are in late December 1776, and by the end of 1776, only a couple of weeks, that army is going to be pretty much gone. It's just going to disappear. Everybody's going to go home, and that's it. So things are really, I can't stress how bad they are for Washington and the Patriot cause. It looked like the army was just not going to exist. Washington was in despair. He wrote to his cousin, and he said, I think the game is pretty near up. Now, I mentioned that the British Army left Washington and went back to New York. However, they did leave some people to guard against Washington trying anything funny. So they left groups of soldiers at several key places in New Jersey, near or on the Delaware River, which was the border with Pennsylvania. And a lot of these little detachments that they left behind were Hessians. We'll talk a little bit more about Hessians. We'll take a few minutes later to kind of go into more detail about them. But for now, let's just say that you have several small garrisons of Hessians to protect the British Army from the Americans. And one such post was the city of Trenton, New Jersey. Meanwhile, back in not just in, I started to say Washington, like Washington, D.C., but all right, that's anachronistic. That's not going to come around for a long time still. But back in Baltimore, where the Congress is meeting, as well as in the Army camps, some people are starting to talk about the possibility of replacing George Washington. Now, it's hard for us to imagine because we have 20/20 hindsight, and we know what effective leader Washington was. But of course, they did not know that at the time. And if you were one of Washington's subordinates, or if you were a politician in Congress at the time, all you could think of is, this is the guy that just lost New York. He lost New York City. He lost several other places in New York State. He's lost New Jersey. All he ever does is retreat. We got to get rid of this guy. We need somebody who actually attacks and fights.
And this is a really good point, to be able to get into history as if you were there and realize that there are multiple outcomes that are possible. This is something that's constantly taken for granted when people look at history, but the people in the story themselves do not know the future. We know that cognitively, but we forget that when we're actually thinking about the story. Washington hasn't had great victories at this point, so it would make sense. He's not a career soldier. People are jockeying for power, so it makes sense that people are asking these questions, not that they're foolish.
Yeah, you've got these ambitious two-star major generals, and brigadier generals, and to a lot of people, Washington just looked like a loser. I mean, name one battle he's won. Crickets chirping. Nothing, except unless you count the Battle of Harlem Heights, which is very minor, more like a skirmish. But so, yeah, we think of these guys and we think, oh my gosh, how could you even consider replacing George Washington? But at the time, they could be forgiven for thinking that he needed to be replaced. It's like, we need somebody who fights. The army's about to disappear. We need somebody who can rally the troops.
So what's his plan to do that?
Washington is saying, hold my beer. Or hold my Madeira.
Hold my tankard of Madeira, yeah.
He did like beer too. But so here's what he did. Washington realizes it's all or nothing. You know, the chips are down and I'm up against the wall. And let me come up with 3 more cliches. But Washington has got to get gutsy. He's got to roll the dice. Okay, so he comes up with a bold plan. He decides he's going to take the fight to the Hessians. So he's going to cross the Delaware River during the night and attack the Hessians at Trenton. To do this, he's going to rely upon John Glover and his Marblehead, Massachusetts ferries, or ferrymen, I should say. They don't have boats there. They're going to have to commandeer them, and you'll talk about that in a minute, so I'll pass that over right now. But he's got to come up with boats, and these men from Massachusetts have got to ferry Washington and the Army across the river. On Christmas Day was the plan, or the evening of Christmas evening, I should say, the evening of December 25th. With a river that's got big chunks of ice in it, and it's going to quite possibly be snowing or sleeting or something. So what could possibly go wrong? It's like everything. But Washington realizes he's got to do something. He can't just sit around, or the army, as we've already said, is going to disappear. By the way, he trusted Colonel John Glover from Marblehead, because these are the same, he and his men are the same people that ferried Washington and the Army from Brooklyn to Manhattan overnight that probably saved the revolution, to be honest with you, back earlier in the year. So Washington's going to cross the main body of his army across the Delaware, as I mentioned. He also wanted to send 700 men under a man named James Ewing to cross the Trenton Ferry and seize the bridge over the Assunpink Creek. Now, folks, you're going to have to get a map that this is just south of the town. I will give you a very simple mental map. Think of a box. That's our map. And then draw a line from east to west. If you want to get technical, it's actually northwest to southeast, a little bit diagonal. That's the Delaware River. Trenton is on the north, or the top, from your perspective, the top side of the river. Washington, the Army, are further to the left and on the bottom side of the river. They're on the west side of the river. Okay. So they're going to have two different groups cross, and then a third detachment would attack a group of the Hessians at Mount Holly, which is at a different location, to keep them from reinforcing Trenton. So Washington comes up with a very complex plan. He often does that. Sometimes Washington's battle plans have been criticized by historians as just too intricate, too complicated, especially when you consider that this army is still far from a professional army. These guys they're not green anymore. They fought, but they still are not anywhere near the quality of the British Army or even the Hessians. The Hessians are professional mercenaries. So, and as it turns out, neither of the second two groups succeeded in their mission, but they did, at least the one group at Mount Holly prevented the Hessians from reinforcing Trenton. Okay, so that's the plan. Three different groups are going to hit Trenton from three different sides, but the main body will cross upriver west of Trenton, cross into New Jersey, and march straight to the right or to the east toward and attack Trenton. They're going to surprise them. Washington realizes that the Hessians are Germans. They will have been partying hardy. They'll be celebrating Christmas. No Christmas for the Americans. Sorry, guys, you got to work. but the Hessians are going to be full of food, full of drink. A lot of them will be asleep. And so the plan is to hit them even before the break of dawn, or right at the break of dawn.
Yeah, this plan does rely on a lot of moving parts coming together. I suppose we could compliment Washington by building in a lot of redundancies, and it's good that he did, since a couple of the groups didn't even make it. But there is something he does on the way there that helps this plan succeed. When the Continental Army goes to Princeton on December 2nd, Washington leaves a blocking force there in case Cornwallis showed up. Then he took the rest of his men to Trenton. Then Washington ordered his troops to seize all the boats on the Delaware River and bring them to Trenton. So now the Americans could cross the river at will, and Cornwallis couldn't. So this is another complication that could have sprung up, but what Washington prevented. That's the plan in motion. Before we get to it, let's take a closer look at our friend the Hessians. We've talked a little bit about them in previous episodes, that they're from Germany. They're pretty rough. The British have told them horror stories about what the Patriots or colonists will do to them if they're captured. But let's take a look at our good friend, the Hessians. What should we know about them, James?
Yeah, let us talk about the Hessians, Scott.
Ja, das ist wunderbar.
Das ist gut, ja. Okay, sorry, that's all my German for today. The Hessians, as we've already touched on, they were German mercenaries. So they're professional soldiers who are there for the paycheck. They don't care about